One of my big philosophies is not saying no on other people's behalf. So a lot of the time there are people that you want to reach out to, you go, oh, but they're probably going to say no, so it doesn't matter. You'll be surprised. Don't stop yourself from reaching out to people and shooting your shot with it. Don't be the reason why they don't come on. Let them decide that it's not the right thing for them, but you don't decide on their behalf. Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and you are listening to episode 192, a very special edition of the Startup Playbook podcast. It was on this day in 2016 where I launched the first 6 episodes of this podcast. And over the last 8 years, I've sat down with almost 200 successful startup founders, investors, and operators to unpack their journey, lessons, and insights. I am so thankful to the incredible guests that we've had on that have taken the time to come on this show. And I am full of gratitude to all of you as part of the Startup Playbook community that have listened, supported, and shared this show over the last few years. The success of the podcast, the guests that we've been able to get on, and everything that we've been able to achieve would not have been possible without all of you. So once again, just wanted to say a big thank you. Before we get into this episode, just 2 very quick notes from me. So first of all, we will be doing an in-person event in Melbourne on the 13th of August to celebrate this milestone. And at this event, I will be doing a live podcast interview with Lee Jasper. Lee Jasper was a former co-founder and co-CEO of Aconex, and he is now the chair of LaunchVic, CEO of Samuel Ventures, and the co-founder and co-CEO of his new company, Firmable. Lee's a fantastic guest. It's going to be a great event, and I hope to see and meet many of you there. I'll add a link to the event registration page into the show notes for this episode. And secondly, for this milestone ep, I also wanted to do something a little bit different. So I will be handing over the hosting duties and the microphone to my good friend James Harrisson, and I will be jumping on the other side of the table to answer some of his and the community's questions in this AMA episode. So once again, just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for all of the support that you've given me and the show over the last few years. And I hope that you enjoy the slightly different format for this episode. So without further ado, let's get into this episode.
Hi Rohit, welcome to your own podcast for a very special edition, 8 years AMA. Congrats on getting so far in the journey.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Definitely a weird experience coming back onto my own podcast, but we've known each other for a while. We've done a few of these together, so looking forward to it.
Yeah, it should be really fun. So yeah, this is sort of an AMA style, so appreciate you giving me the chance to interview you. And obviously I've seen a lot of behind the scenes in the podcast, especially over the past year or 18 months or so. So keen to ask you a few specific questions based on what I've observed in your journey. And then also we've got a bunch of really great questions from the audience that you gave a bit of a call out to get some questions, so keen to dive into them as well. But yeah, I guess as a starting point, Rohit, obviously you've explained your journey with the podcast before, but I think you started this 8 years ago now. I believe it was always your intention to do this for 10 years and see what happens. So would love to maybe just go back to what your intention was with the podcast right at the start, how you thought about approaching it, and then how's that evolved or changed, if at all, over these first 8 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think now the story is that I've wanted to do it for 10 years, but I guess going back 8 years, podcasts are so accepted now. But back then, a lot of people didn't really listen to podcasts that frequently, didn't really know what they were. I still had to explain to people what a podcast was when I was recording the conversation. And so I think back then, I didn't think that it would be where it is now. And I didn't think that podcasts would be such a big part of the culture as they are now. The reasons why I started it was, I think I've mentioned this multiple times, I've written about it, but there were a couple of reasons. So after my first startup, just would have a lot of founders that would reach out to me for help, support, guidance, and connections. And I had a tiny bit of experience from my own background, but felt like they should learn from people that were much smarter and more experienced than I was. But also at that time, even the ecosystem was very different as well. And so I think startups were just starting to get popular, and I was seeing a lot of people trying to come into the space and give advice to founders having never run a company before. And I think their advice came with good intentions, but was violently different to the advice that I would give to founders myself based on my own experience. And so the whole premise of the show was, can we bring on people that have been there and done it before, so that at least you're hearing from people that have gone through the journey and can talk about their lessons, having lived that experience versus theoretically what they would do if they were in that particular situation. And I think selfishly as well, at the end of my first company, I just realized I had no networks. I was still very new and very green, and just wanted an excuse to sit down with really smart people and pick their brain for an hour and learn a bunch from them, and hopefully use that to to improve my own learning, but also, hopefully build a bunch of relationships and networks off the back of that.
Yeah. And it's funny because it seems so obvious today in terms of doing a podcast, and it seems like every man and his dog has a podcast these days. But obviously back then, like you said, very different kind of environment when it came to content and podcasting. I guess, what was it that you saw in that medium or that platform that gave you conviction that would be something that would be worth exploring? How did you think about it?
Yeah, it's funny. I was at a dinner last night and I was talking to someone about this. So I had listened to a grand total of 3 podcast interviews before I decided to launch my own. Again, I didn't necessarily think that this was the thing. I think that at that time I was just a very different stage in my career. And I think one thing that I has been a really good strength and also weakness at times is just being able to throw things up against the wall and see what sticks. And so this was just one of the things that I tried. I think that I had a very simple thesis around it, which was, if you bring on smart people and pick their brains and learn from them, I was very much asking the questions that I wanted to know the answers to. So at the very least, even if no one listened, I was at least getting something out of it, and it was worth my time to do that. And if anything else happened off the back of it, that was a bonus. But this was just a habit of me being able to push myself to get in front of a lot of people that I would maybe have been intimidated to reach out to, or didn't really have an excuse to talk to, but he was a reason for me to reach out to them. And at the start, so much of it is built on people's will of going, they're not necessarily getting something off the back of this because you don't really have an audience, you don't really have anything to give to them. But then over time, that sort of equation flips. And so it was always with the intention of, one day, hopefully this will become a thing that will also it's not a one-way trade of value.
Yes, 100%. I think it's a good point and something that's worth highlighting, that sometimes getting a break or an opportunity is not so much magically being able to see the future. It's just about being able to try a bunch of different things and iterate and see what works. Very much the same as even building a product in a startup. You got to try a bunch of different things and see what works. And so it sounds like you just came in, you saw that there's potential in this idea, but you also made it a win-win. So even if it didn't work as you intended it to originally, there's still going to be a ton of benefits, like meeting interesting people, connecting with them, practicing your communication skills, all this stuff. And so you almost capped the downside and made it that no matter what happened, you would win either way, which is good.
Yeah, just playing kind of long-term games with it, right? And again, I think you and I have spoken about this several times, of just, if you believe in the thesis of it, it's really simple. There's no way that it doesn't work out. You just have to do it for long enough for that to play out. And I think maybe the counter to that, because like you said, again, I think it's easy to say I saw this early, all those sort of things. I think one of my regrets over the last 8 years is maybe not seeing that early enough or taking it seriously enough. So I think that I always treated the podcast as a side hustle and something on the side of like businesses that I was running, or just other things. It was just, like I said, almost like a hobby and an excuse to do that. I think it took me a lot longer than it should have to actually realize like the value and power of this.
That's really interesting. So what would you do anything differently if you could go back 8 years to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would take a lot of the distribution stuff a lot more seriously. I think the challenging parts of doing a podcast, especially going through that journey, is, it is very hard to see a return on this for a very, very long time. And I think one of the, again, I think it's just part of the process. And I think part of my process was the reason why it worked and why I've been able to do it for so long is I almost didn't take it too seriously, and there wasn't a pressure to turn it into a business and for it to become an income or revenue generating exercise, not obsessing about everything. That I think it's a little bit different now, where, you're in a world where Joe Rogan's, selling his podcast for $100 million. A lot of people build their entire businesses and careers around this. I never even thought that was possible. Like again, when I launched this, and I think I've mentioned this before, I didn't even know people would actively search out and listen and download it. I thought you and I would have a conversation. You would say, hey, I need advice on fundraising or whatever. I'm like, okay, cool. Here's a link to go and download this. So that was a base that I started with. And I think in some ways, although, like I said, a regret that I have is that maybe I didn't take it as seriously as I wish I had earlier on. I think it's also one of the things that almost took the pressure off and allowed this to be what it was for me, which allowed me to do it for an extended period of time, even though, for most sane people, it probably didn't make sense.
Yeah. That's a great point. And again, it's one of those things where, like you said, you maybe could have taken it more seriously, but there's a chance that if you had done that, maybe you would have fell out of love with it and stopped doing it after 4 years instead of 8 years. And so you can never really tell looking back, but it seems like it's worked out pretty well so far, which is great.
Yeah, it's, love the grind of it. And I think, I think there's a big part of it, which is like people trying to turn their hobbies into a business, which I think works, but a lot of the time people end up hating their hobby or not really doing it with the same passion and love. And so I think, there's been kind of periods of things like that for me. But I think, like I said, there's a counter and a balance to everything. And as much as I wish that I'd seen the potential of what this could be earlier on, I think it had to happen the way that it happened for me to just stick with it for as long as I needed to see the other side of this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point and something I'd be keen to learn a bit more about, because as you mentioned there were a couple of times where you felt like, I don't know if it was like burnt out on it or just lost a bit of the spark for the podcast, and you have taken a couple of extended breaks from publishing over this last 8 years, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I think it's quite challenging as well. If someone is doing something that's working, there can be a lot of fear around, hey, I need to take this step back, or I feel like I need to take this step back, but I feel like if I do, all of this work that I've done is going to be for nothing. So just curious, maybe you could talk a little bit about those 2 periods that you took as a bit of a break from publishing and how you thought of it at the time and whether you think that was necessary and just overall thoughts.
Yeah, great question. And I know it's something you and I have spoken about before as well, because for those people listening, if you don't already know, James had a great podcast himself that he was running for a while. And I think we've both kind of gone through periods where we took a little bit of a break and talking through that process. I guess the first time I took it, I was publishing every single week, even on holidays, without fail for, I think, 3 years, 3.5, 4 years. And I said I was always doing it on the side of something else. And it became something that instead of me getting excited to talk to people and learn and doing it for the reasons why I initially started it, it became a chore of, I've got to find someone and record the interview and publish this week. Like it's just a habit of just doing something versus being really excited and giving it the energy that is needed to grow. And I think that's one of the weirdly like the downsides of being consistent and having habit is sometimes you can just get into that mode of just...
It's mechanical.
It's just very mechanical. It's very structured, and you don't take the opportunity to step back and, again, bring the energy and all of those sort of things with it. I think that was really hard, like you said, and I think we've had several conversations about this of just deciding to take a break. I think it was 9 months in total at the end. And through that whole period, because again, I feel like I had this with my first company as well. I think so much of your identity gets tied to this, and we tie a lot of who we are as people to what we do for work. And, the podcast is more public and all those sort of things. So it's just the association that people have with it. And then suddenly you go, well, like that's not there anymore. And trying to, if someone asks you what you're doing, like, I don't really know. I don't really know what's coming. Yeah, like I'll come back at some point. I'm not really sure. And I think the other side of that as well is after a certain point, there's the fear of, have I just thrown it all away? Do I need to start from scratch again? If I do start this, will anyone care? Will anyone listen? And all those sort of things. And I think the amazing thing of when I did come back after 9 months was like, I was just in a place where I was so excited to bring it back. And it was the right time. And I think the podcast just went to a completely different level. And I don't think that would have been possible had I not taken the break. So I think that this is probably my own tendency, is I have a way of like working myself to burnout, and then I'm just dead, and I need to take a break. And there's probably more sustainable ways to do that. But knowing myself with this, I needed that break to really realign why I wanted to do this, really figure out what I was doing with it. Like I just needed to give myself space because, like I said, the podcast wasn't the only thing I was doing. There was just always other things. And even the most recent break that I took, which is because I was running a startup, it just came from a point of I was running the startup. We have our syndicate that we run together. I had the podcast and I was like, something has to give and I need to prioritize things in the right way. And I think also there was a a really big part of me as well, that we had taken on funding from a lot of people that I had built relationships with over an extended period of time that had put their faith in something that was very new and different. And I felt very responsible for that. On top of that, we have a team that we're asking to work really hard. And I was fortunate that I had you essentially managing the syndicate for us. But I am also conscious of adding something else on the plate and asking other people to work really hard when it feels like I'm doing multiple other things at once. So it doesn't matter how much energy and effort that I was putting into the startup. It's partly a perception. And that was my thing as well. And so, but also one of those things where I was just like, this is a big opportunity and I want to double down on this and give this the energy and focus that it needs to be something, if it is something. But, it's just trade-offs that you make.
Yeah, 100%. And I love what you said. And I do remember just prior to you taking that first break that you took, I remember we caught up one time and we caught up in the city. I remember you were like walking down the street, pulling this suitcase of all your equipment.
With broken wheels.
With broken wheels. And you just looked so disheveled at that point. I remember that. And I remember when you came back, you really just accelerated things. You had a couple of really like high profile guests after that break and really just ramped things up. And then even coming back from this second break as well. Yeah, obviously I've been a part of that journey and it's just, we've been like reinvigorated and grinding and doing 3 episodes in a day and all this kind of stuff. And so it's really great to see that. And like you said, to do that sometimes requires you to take a temporary step back so that you can really take 10 steps forward and take things to the next level. So it's good that you found that rhythm for yourself.
Yeah. And I think it is really tough from like a founder perspective as well, is because there's a million things going on. There's always some things. And I think one of the big bits of advice that I give to founders when I speak to them is find a way to be able to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So even sometimes you face challenges or issues with the business and you think it's the end of the world. A lot of it is just keeping things in perspective. In 6 months, that won't seem like that big of a deal. And even just talking to other founders, you'll find people that are dealing with issues that are 5 or 6 times or 10 times bigger. And yeah, I think it's just maintaining that sort of perspective to be able to overcome difficult time periods. My way of doing that with the podcast has been to take a step back and take a break and then give myself the time to reassess things. Can't really do that when you're running a business. So I think it's more about finding pockets and ways of being able to do and manage that for yourself.
Yeah. I think as well, another thing you said, which I really love, is it's almost like that identity piece as well, which it sounds like that was a real challenge for you for that first break that you took of, it's almost like I am the podcast or this is who I am and who am I without it in a way. And so I'm just curious, did you learn anything around that from that experience of taking a step back? What you thought was your identity may have been one thing. Did you learn anything about yourself from that period?
Yes, great question. I mean, it was difficult. I think I had the benefit that I'd gone through that before with my first company. And I think that was so much harder. Yeah. And I think that again, it's almost going through that process for everyone can tell you it won't matter in a while and that you are more than just what you do for work. But it's not until you experience that for yourself. And for me, going through that period once with the startup and then again with the podcast and seeing that, oh, actually, it's so much better by taking a break instead of just trying to push through for the sake of pushing through. I think the other part of that as well is I think that a lot of the time we think that people care a lot more than they actually care. Everyone's busy doing their own thing. And what I was saying earlier in terms of facing challenging times in the business or facing a really difficult moment, a lot of the time we can make that bigger because it is the biggest thing in our lives and it's the first time that we're experiencing some of those sort of things. But most of the time, people have gone through something very similar or going through more difficult things, or someone's like, yeah, I just went through that a little while ago and here's what you do. So I think, a big part of that is being able to have a community of people around you or just even other founders that you can talk to or those sort of things I've found to be very helpful. But again, for me, I can have those conversations, but I almost need to go and experience that for myself to
truly understand it.
To truly understand it, yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Curious as well, because obviously you've been doing the podcast for 8 years now, close to 200 episodes now, which is just phenomenal consistency and longevity. I guess I'm just curious, you were, your late 20s when you started the podcast. And so a lot can change and your stage of life evolves as well. So I'm just curious, has the kind of topics you've been interested in or the questions you ask guests, has that evolved over time depending on the stage of life you're in? Just curious because 8 years is a long time and you must have changed a lot as a person over that time period as well. So how has that affected the line of questioning and things you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I would hope, and I would like to think that the line of questioning has changed and evolved. I think, like I said, I mean, to me, I think the podcast is a very selfish endeavor in many ways, which is I ask the questions that I want to ask. I get to know those sort of things. And I think I mean, maybe I'm not the best person to answer this because other people who listen to it, have been listening to it for a while, may see that. But yeah, I think that one of the big changes for me, and I guess I don't think I've spoken about this publicly, but one of the big reasons why I stepped away from the startup earlier this year is I had an experience with my family at the end of last year that really opened my eyes into how I had been living my life for a very long time, which is business came first over family and everything else. And I think it was the first time that I realized that I wasn't really living up to the values that I thought that I said were really important for me. So if I put down what I said was really important and actually played that out into how the things that I was doing, they didn't match up and they didn't line up. And so, yeah, I guess one of the bigger things with the podcast is probably just, I think at the start it was very tactical and I was very focused on what's the one key takeaway that I can apply to my own business and those sort of things. And I like to think and I hope that there's still something that people take away and apply to the business. But I think it's probably evolved a little bit more into understanding people and understanding what drives them and understanding how it fits into life overall and why they make decisions. Because I think tactics to a degree can come and go with things. I think the things that kind of last is what makes us, why we do what we do, what makes us as people, and what drives us and all those sort of things. And so, yeah, again, I don't know. Like you tell me.
Yeah. I mean, it's so true. And I have personally noticed that as well. I feel like the evolution has almost been towards a more holistic, from purely just business and metrics and all these tactics, like you said. So I think you explore a lot more broader life categories and you're interested in the guest perspective beyond just business. So how do they navigate their personal relationships and all these kind of things? And I think that's really interesting. And I personally find it a lot more interesting and you get a more well-rounded picture because that's the thing. It's like you can be a top performer in one very specific area of life, but how do your personal relationships look and how's your health and all these other metrics, which are equally, if not more important than that. So it's really interesting for me to get an insight into some of these people and how they think about those things as well. And I feel like you've been a lot more deliberate just from listening of actually like unpacking those other areas of life, which to me is a really interesting area to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much content out there that I think it can, I don't know, I just feel like everyone's got their own style and people will resonate with the content that sort of resonates with them. Like I said, I think I've always tried to build the content around what do I find really interesting and then trusting that almost if I find it interesting, enough other people will find that interesting as well. And yeah, like I think there's so many great podcasts out there that dive into the tactics and all those sort of things. I think I've also been very conscious of the experience for the guests that come on for the show as well as the listeners. So a lot of the time it can get very repetitive very quickly. A lot of the people that I have on the podcast, you know, some people it's their first interview, but a lot of the time people have done multiple other podcast interviews and things like that as well. And so there's nothing worse than hearing the same stories, the same thing over and over again, which is why, again, I don't know if it comes across. I'm not the best person to say that, but what I try and do is really hone in on what's a little bit different with that particular person. Hopefully bring something a little bit different to both the guest that comes on the show, but also experience with the listeners who have probably heard them on speak at other conferences or other podcasts.
100%. And yeah, I have specifically noticed, I feel like almost every guest who comes on, there's always a point where they say, oh, wow, I can't believe you found that out, or where did you hear that from about this kind of thing? So I feel like you do dig into these really interesting areas, which segues into another question I want to ask around just the work that I guess goes into the podcast. I think it'll be really interesting for the audience to understand, because obviously the audience listening listens to or sees the end product and it's a very seamless experience. But obviously being involved and seeing what goes on behind the scenes, I know there's a ton of work to just release an episode and prepare for that. So we'd love if you could share to the audience a bit of your process and the work behind the scenes that goes into making a great podcast episode.
Yeah, I think it might also be useful to talk about the evolution of that, because what I do now is so different to what happened at the start. So at the start, at the very, very start, I literally had 10 questions that I would come, or how many other questions, and I would go through that list. What I realized very, very quickly, I think even just a couple of episodes in, is it's not the feel that I want to have. It doesn't really feel like a conversation. It feels like an interview, but interviewing like almost like a job interview.
Yeah.
And so I was like, screw it, I'll scrap the interviews. I work in extreme, so like I'll scrap the questions entirely and I'll almost go in cold. And what that forced me to do is really hone in and listen to the guests, because I had no other material around me. So to keep the conversation going and flowing in a natural way, I had to become really good at listening and trying to keep a conversation that's hopefully interesting going for an hour or so. I think I got to a point where that worked for a period, but I also felt, again, a lot of other podcasts started coming up and those sort of things. And I just felt like it is really easy to then just get into very surface level, repetitive process around those sort of things. And so, as you mentioned now, the whole process, behind the scenes process for each interview is very different. So there's a couple of different things. So there's usually a little bit of back and forth in actually picking a guest and then scheduling something in. I'll generally, if they're not someone that I already know, I'll generally jump on a call with them and just get to know them. That's just a way to make sure that we get along well enough to have an interesting conversation. And then, yeah, I'll generally listen back to or read articles that they've written, press releases, or just things that have happened in the news. I'll listen to a few podcast episodes. I also speak to a couple of people close to the guest. So sometimes they're people that I already know. Sometimes they'll introduce me to someone. Interesting stories and anecdotes that can come in that we can use for the podcast. So for each interview, I probably have about 8 pages of notes that I then whittle down to maybe 5-6 talking points or some quotes and things like that I want to bring in. So it's almost like the combination of the two, which is I still want to be in the moment, and we don't always cover, and most of the time we don't cover all the topics that I've got as notes, but it's almost being prepared with that material so that you can take the conversation in different ways or do different depths of things. I think one other thing, if we're going to get really tactical on the podcast side as well, is I think the trust is really important to get people to open up. I think some people are naturally very gifted storytellers. But again, it can be the same stories over and over again. For other people, especially some of the guests that don't do a lot of media, and I've somehow convinced them to come on and do their first ever podcast interview, I think a large part of it is making people feel comfortable. And so some people that I've had on the show I've known for years, and that's very natural. And for other people, you have to build that. And so one way that I try and do that is very early on, strategically, I will try and drop a story or something different that I've picked up about them. And what I'm trying to get across is that this isn't just me turning on the microphone and let's wing it. I've come prepared with this, and I respect and value your time enough to have done research and all of those sort of things. And I think that I've noticed people's kind of shoulders just drop a little bit and people get a little bit more comfortable with those sort of things, but maybe that's just me reading into things. But yeah, it's just one of the things that I try and do. And again, I think that only comes with the time and preparation. It just takes a long time to get there, especially if you're doing episodes weekly, or, if we're recording 3 or 4 interviews in a day. But it's I think those smaller details that hopefully help make for a better interview.
Yeah, they really do. And I think that's the difference, right, between someone who's okay and records some interviews versus someone who's world-class at what they do. It's those small little details that really make the big difference. And so I personally really notice that in your interviews, and I think a lot of the audience does as well. So it's really great. I'm just curious as well.
We're going to take a very quick break from this podcast to talk about an important issue, which is the growth of your business. Specifically, how long sales cycles when selling to large enterprise customers can slow down progress for so many startups. Unfortunately, a portion of this is out of your control, but something you can do to accelerate your sales cycles and sell to bigger customers is to demonstrate your security compliance with standards like ISO 27001 or SOC 2. The problem is that achieving compliance can be a big distraction and a large financial and operational drain for your company. Thankfully, our partners for the show, Vanta, can help with this. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance, getting you audit ready quickly and saving you up to 85% of associated costs. And Vanta scales with your business, helping you continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. There are over 7,000 fast-growing companies like Atlassian and Dovetail that use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. They've been supporters of the show for a while now and are doubling down in their support for our community by offering $1,000 US off their plans. To access this exclusive offer, head over to vanta.com/playbook. That's VANTA.com/playbook. All right, let's get back to this episode.
Podcasts are notorious for having high churn. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's 90% of people don't make it past 10 episodes. And if you make it to 23 episodes, you're in the top 1% of podcasters. Obviously, you're going on 8 years and almost 200 episodes. So definitely in that top 1%, I would say. I'm just curious if you thought about what's allowed you to keep going when so many other people quit. Have you ever thought about that?
Yes and no. Again, I think one of the things I was very grateful of is, although there was no, like I was saying earlier, there's no return on investment per se in terms of dollar figures. I think that very quickly I got some validation that people were getting value from this. I think it's very hard if you don't see anything at all to keep going. But I think it was the one thing that I was just like, when people talk about product market fit, I think it was the first time that I'd experienced that in something that just took off very quickly. So again, fortunate for the time that it launched 8 years ago, very different market, very different competitive landscape from a podcasting perspective, but it hit number 3 on iTunes. And I think that gave me a sense of validation, but then also just the comments and feedback and all those sort of things that were there were just that people were getting a ton of value from that themselves. And so I think I just needed to know that at least it was resonating with some people, which helped. And then I think a big part of this as well is just, I think all of business and all these sort of things, like a big part of it is, you learn tactical lessons and you learn growth lessons and you learn a ton about business. But I think for me, more importantly, you learn a lot about yourself as well. And something that I learned a very long time ago is that I am so much more accountable to other people than I am to myself. And again, I've mentioned this several times before, but one of the hacks that I had to make sure that I publish an episode next week was at the end of every episode, I would say, see you next week. And I was terrified of going to an event and someone coming up and saying, hey, last week you said that you would publish an episode, but there's no episode this week. What are you doing? No one would care. No one would probably notice. But it was something that then for me, it was like, it doesn't matter. So many times I would edit until 3 a.m. because there's a bunch of other things that I was doing, but it was a thing that I had to do. And so it takes a while to build a habit, but like with anything, once you overcome that, then it becomes almost more difficult to remove that from your regular routine. But it is hard. And I think like with anything, I think those stats are so interesting. I've heard them over the years, but I think something like podcasting in particular, like with anything new and shiny, there's a lot of excitement and a lot of fun things and potential that you think about what it could be. And so very easy to get started relatively to do the first few episodes. The grind of that then hits you really hard. You're like, now to do this every single week, or however frequently people are launching that, like that becomes very daunting very quickly. And so, it's hard. It's really, really hard. And like I said, I think one of the challenging parts now is that because of the success that they've seen other people have, I think it is a lot easier to come with a frame of reference of this needs to be my full-time thing. I need to make a bunch of money out of this out the gate, or it needs to be the thing that completely changes the trajectory of my business, where the real value of doing something like this is it compounds over time and it will take you a very, very long time. You just need to go through that period of hurt and a long period where it doesn't make any sense. But if you're coming with it from a reference of it needs to make me money, it needs to do all these things, I think it's very hard to keep yourself going for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before you see something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a great point. It's first of all knowing yourself and what keeps you motivated. And then also, again, like you said, for you specifically, not seeing that early traction and the growth, but then also realizing it's a long-term game and not getting too caught up in short-term metrics. And
yeah, one other thing that I stopped doing is I stopped looking at download numbers for the show. I mean, aside from when I have to go in every week to upload a new episode, I think at the start I would obsess over my ranking on iTunes, download numbers, all of those sort of things. What I realized was that my mood was getting so affected by it. And typically, if I was really surprised in a positive way with the numbers, that would last for 10 seconds. And more often than not, if it was not exactly what I expected, that would stay with me for days. It's just the way that I am. And unfortunately, I think most people in the space are wired a little bit like that. So, and then I just got to a point where I was like, you know what? If I'm happy with the episode and I trust that what I'm putting out is good enough, over time, if I'm doing this over an extended period of time, over time, the numbers will catch up. I'm not worried about that at all. Even periods that I took a break, I was still getting so many more downloads than I was getting when I was churning out episodes every week at the start. It just compounds. So it was just that trust. If I put out something that's good enough, I know that I think I can look at general trends of things and just go, actually, has everyone stopped listening? All those sort of things. But yeah, I think removing that sort of pressure and that friction from it and removing that validation from, in a sense, these vanity metrics around those sort of things helped me change the approach to that. And it was more about, am I happy enough with this episode to put it out? Am I proud of these interviews and this episode coming out? And if I'm not, then that's a bigger issue for me than specifically how many downloads I'm getting in a week.
100%. I've heard you say before as well, it's around what are the things you can control, what are the inputs you can control, and then let the outputs take care of themselves. And so sounds like that was a lot of it as well, is just working out what are the things that actually matter to you and what are the things you can control, and then make sure you're doing them. And as long as you're doing them, you're happy, and then the outputs take care of themselves. Yeah, exactly.
And I think that kind of comes down to belief in what it is that you're doing. I think if you're a little bit unsure of, is this the right model, is this the right type of thing, is this the right type of industry or segment of market that I'm going after, I think, I think then looking at numbers and things like that makes total sense. I think for me, it's almost stupidly simple. This is an idea around the podcast was just, it's so obvious that it's dumb. I just need to believe that if I do this for long enough, and I don't know how long that time period is, if I do it for long enough, at some point, it just works.
Yeah.
But that's easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done. And one thing I would say from a third party standpoint as well is I think grit is definitely one of your superpowers. So I'm sure that's probably helped as well in getting things done. Yeah,
like I said, I mean, a strength in some ways. I think it's also, like I said earlier, also leads to burnout and those sort of things as well. And so I think, I think that take the good with the bad.
Yeah, it's always a double-edged sword. Yeah. But that's incredible. And you mentioned it before, and we both observe it. I think it seems like everyone has a podcast these days, which is obviously very different to 8 years ago. And there's a ton of people who ask me, and I'm sure you get asked every day of, should I start a podcast or how should I think about it? For someone who is thinking or going through that process of, should I start a podcast? It seems like Rohit's had great success. I've seen Joe Rogan, all these other people, like you said, I want to do that. What would you say to someone who asks you that question?
Well, don't put me and Joe Rogan in the same sentence. In terms of like success, I think what he's done is absolutely incredible. I would say So taking a step back, I think the podcast has been the single most trajectory, life-changing, career-changing thing that I've decided to do. Very random for someone who was very introverted, had never edited or recorded a piece of audio before they decided to launch one. And so I think on that basis, I would tell everyone that this has changed my life and absolutely everyone should do it. I think the counter to that, though, is it is those things because you do it for long enough to build the habits, to learn the skills, to overcome some of those things. And I think my advice would probably be just come at it with the right frame of reference and with the right intentions. I think that if you want to, there are so many easier ways of getting the benefits of starting a podcast or being on a podcast than starting a podcast yourself. And so just be real with yourself in terms of what is it that you're hoping or wanting to get out of it. If it is money, if it is something that generates income, if it's something that becomes a growth channel for your business, all those sort of things, there are far more easier ways of doing that than doing a podcast. I think it's very impactful, but just figure out where this sits in your priority list of doing those sort of things. Maybe to give a very practical example, I think that going on podcasts is extremely useful and helpful from a branding perspective, from being able to tap into a particular audience if the podcast is big enough and the audience is relevant enough and all of those sort of things. But the whole process of if you're using this tactically as a growth lever for your business, finding the podcasts, reaching out to them, scheduling an interview, the interview going live, all of those sort of things, it takes a long time to get there. And if if this is a core part of the growth of your business and this is something that you need to happen quickly, that doesn't align with what you need tactically from your business from that perspective. But there are far quicker and easier ways to get the benefit of being on a podcast without having to go through that whole process. So something I've funnily been talking to a couple of founders about helping them with is almost recording like mock interviews, because a lot of the time we just want to take clips from that and share that on social media. You don't need to record a full podcast interview to do that. You can set up cameras and microphones and get prompted questions and just use that as clips as part of your marketing engagement or posts on LinkedIn and all of those sort of things. And so to answer your question, I think I would advise everyone to start a podcast based on the impact that it's had for me. But I think that for a lot of people to get what it is that they really want from it, they don't need to start a podcast. There's other ways of getting the results, the outcomes, the output that they want than having to do all of the work required to do that.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's working out what's actually the outcome that you want and begin with end in mind, and then work backwards from that. If this is a certain outcome that you want, what's the most efficient path to get there? Doing a podcast may or may not be that. So just be mindful of that. It's good advice. I guess I had one more question, Rohit, and then we'll dive into some questions from the audience. But I'm just curious, have you ever thought about, you mentioned just before, the podcast has been one of the most impactful things you've done for your life and career. Let's say go back 8 years and you decided never to start the podcast and you hadn't done that. Have you ever thought about where your life would be right now if that was the case?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a really good question. So I don't know if I would have started the podcast 8 years ago. I think that was a very big sort of inflection point for me. I think, like I said, especially for the stage that I was in my career and the type of person that I was just willing to try a lot of different things. And so this is like on reflection, it's funny how things play out because no one really remembers all the random things that you try and that didn't work out. Like people will remember one or two things around stuff. And so I think it's not really answering your question, going on a weird tangent, but I think a lot of the time we get caught up in, what if it doesn't work? What if it fails? Around those sort of things. And like I said, people do not care or pay as much attention as you think that they do in terms of what everyone's doing. And so it was a really big inflection point. But even if it hadn't happened 8 years ago, I find it very difficult to think that I wouldn't have kept throwing things up against the wall until I ended up launching this. And so maybe it would have happened at a different time period. I think I got so lucky in the time that I launched because it gave me a little bit of a head start. I had a bit of white space to work with and figure out things. It is so difficult to launch a podcast now without an audience, and it's really hard to cut through the noise. And I was, again, like I said, very lucky in terms of the time that I launched, but I find it very difficult to imagine me not trying it at some stage and maybe not seeing the same level of early traction that I did from when I launched. But I think the thing for me about podcasts is I've just found the medium that works for me in that. And I want to get better at writing. I want to get better at being in front of the camera myself and all those sort of things. There are skills that I want to develop, but in terms of things that I think come naturally to me that I'm better at, this is the right medium. And I think I would have kept throwing things up against the wall until I eventually landed here anyway. But again, for whatever reason, I launched it when I did and got very lucky.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny. I think you're probably right. There's in a way you probably would have ended up in a similar place, but it could have been through a different channel or medium. But this is just what happened to work at that time, and then you really saw that opportunity and doubled down on it.
Yeah, and I think maybe not have ended up in the same place. I think, again, a lot of the opportunities that came for me and those sort of things, it just reinforces a lot of those things. So seeing the podcast early and trying a lot of different things, I think, is a part of who I am, and then also becomes a reason why I love startups and love trying very different types of businesses or what we do in investing. And we invest very, very early into companies where, again, a lot of the time it doesn't make a lot of sense and there's not a lot of data points and those sort of things. But I think that's just who I am, and which is why I think that maybe it wouldn't have happened 8 years ago, but I find it very difficult to think that I would have struggled to make anything else work, and it would have eventually come back to this anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. You would have heard me say many times on this podcast before that I am such a big believer in surrounding yourself with the right people. And that's why I'm delighted to partner with Sender. Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia, catering to all stages of your business life. If you're busy running a startup, you don't always have the time to balance your own books or do forecasts, and instead you can fully outsource your finance function to give you the time, energy, and resources that you need back to do what you do best, which is growing your business. They have a dedicated focus on founders, funders, and startups, and have an experienced team that can help you with everything from managing your tax to balancing your books to even helping with your exit strategy. I trust and use them with all of my businesses and can't recommend them highly enough. To find out more or to speak to Gareth and the team, head over to sender.com. That's SCENDAR.com. All right, let's get back to this episode.
So I want to dive into a few questions that we have from the audience. So you put out a few call outs for some questions and we got some great ones that came through. So a lot of different topics. So growth, podcasting, investing, operating. So I'm just going to go through a few questions and we'd love to get your thoughts.
Go for it.
So David McManus asks, how did you get your initial followers for the podcast? And what were the key growth tactics that you used?
So I think there's a blog post that I wrote 7 years ago after my first year. And I think I kind of shared how I got my first few listeners. I think, so I had spent so at that time, I was just spending all my time in the startup space. I spent a bunch of time, meeting with founders for coffee and just trying to help them in some way. And a big part of that growth was maybe to take a step back, I didn't think anyone would like the podcast, to be honest. So what I did to hedge my bets was I decided to record and publish 6 episodes at once, which is not what a lot of people do, not realizing how difficult that would be in a 3-week period. So I launched with 6 episodes thinking that I'm going to reach out to, I think there was 70, 80 people maybe that I'd met for coffee in the previous few months, where I had tried to be as helpful as possible to them, hadn't really asked for anything in return. My whole growth idea around that was I'm going to email all of those people individually and say, I've launched this podcast, I've launched this thing, would love for you to check it out. And if you like it, can you please share it with someone else? And I was like, I feel like I'm asking a lot of these people. So what I want to do is have a wider cross-section of guests as possible. So I think we had Justin Dry from Vinomofo. We had Tim Mundy was the first ever episode. He ran a employment branding agency. There was Shelley, who was an angel investor. And so it was just, like I said, a wide cross-section of guests with the hope that they would at least find one of them interesting enough to click on and listen to. I think what kind of benefited off the back of that was usually if you're launching something like that, there's just one episode and then that's kind of it. And you have to wait another week or 2 weeks or whatever the cadence is of release to launch it versus, I guess, if people like the episode, what I wasn't expecting was that they would go and listen to all of the other episodes there as well. And it builds that habit for people. And for whatever reason, it resonated. I also thought that, I was like, I'll start with a few people that I know here locally. And then all my context for podcast was it's all international. So I'm going to try and get international guests and make it like everything else. All of the feedback that I got early on was it's so great to have a podcast with an Australian context where a lot of the stuff, if we are listening to anything at this time, or a lot of the advice is very US centric. So it's great to have something with an Australian lens, even in terms of Australian founders raising money in the US. What does that process look like? Because they said that they never really got to experience or hear any of that. And so I think that gave me a really clear, this is what people want. So great. This is not what I was expecting, but here's something for me to focus on. And so I think that was where I got the majority of my listeners. And then I did a little bit of content writing, wrote some articles for different publications and those sort of things. But yeah, I would say this is, again, one of my regrets of not taking the podcast seriously enough was because I was always doing it on the side of running other businesses or other things. It was always, I just never had enough time to do what it is that I really wanted to do to really promote and push the show. And so the whole promotion model was bring on someone really interesting, have a good enough interview that they liked it, that they want to share to other people, and hopefully make it interesting enough for people to stick around and listen to other episodes. That was it. And so even now I probably don't do as much promotion as I should, but it's off the back of, just very simply, can you just create hopefully a good enough interview that people want to, if they're new, that they'll want to stick around and listen to other episodes. And if it's interesting enough for people to want to share and listen and download.
Yep. No, that's great advice. And yeah, it seemed to work very well for you in that initial stages. Sometimes it is that hand-to-hand combat, right? Of just like getting things off the ground. And then eventually that flywheel kicks in if there's enough traction. So another question from Ian Dooley. He asks, what is the best bit of free PR advice that you have ever given or received?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I will maybe take a step back from this and talk about like what is the purpose of PR for it. So podcasting is a type of PR. Obviously getting written up in newspapers or publications is another type of PR. I think from my experience, I don't know if anyone told me or it was my experience, because even with my first company, we were very good at getting PR, but it's my understanding that a lot of the time PR won't necessarily equate to leads or growth for the business. And so again, like with anything else, it's just understanding where it is that it fits in to the strategic growth or marketing for your business. I think the right types of podcasts, the right types of articles can obviously do that. But a lot of the time, the value of PR is, building credibility and trust in the market, especially if you're a relatively early stage business and no one's heard of you before. There's at least a proof point that you can take when you're talking to clients or potential investors, or investors won't be convinced by PR, but just something that kind of shows that you're legitimate and you're not just two people working out of a basement, which might be the case with things. In terms of actually getting press coverage, there's a whole podcast that we can do about that, but high level advice, I would say focus on exclusives where possible. So just be very strategic with people and give the publication or those sorts of things leads with things. So even for my show, I have a lot of people that will reach out wanting to talk about something that's breaking at that time. And sometimes I'll do it. But again, if they're on multiple different podcasts, personally, I don't want to be one of a bunch of other podcasts talking about the same thing over and over again. If they're doing a couple of other podcast episodes, then I trust that topic and area will be covered. And if it makes sense at a later time, we'll bring the guest on. So I think just be really deliberate with the publication that you want to lead the story or whatever that medium or channel is. And also, I guess from my perspective, I haven't worked in media specifically. I can only talk about my experience, but I get pitched probably about 40 inbound requests a week to come on the show. The majority of them don't really go anywhere, either because there isn't a fit or whatever. But I would say that a large part of it is just trying to understand what is it that is going to be a fit for that particular publication or that guest. So an exclusive is a great way to show them, here, you should write about the story because this isn't going to anyone else, and we're happy to make ourselves available and let you break the story. Or for me with the podcast, it's just them showing that they've understood the podcast and why they would be a good guest on the show. So I guess do some research in terms of the types of guests that have been on the show before, the types of content that they talk about, if there's something topical, all those sort of things help. But yeah, like I said, I mean, there's a whole...
Could talk about tactics for hours.
Tactics that we can talk about. But I would say just be high level, just understand the purpose behind why you're hoping to get PR, what you want out of it, and then be really strategic with who you go out to and the way that you seed that out in market.
Yep. That's cool. That's a great answer.
I don't even know if that answered the question, but yeah.
Nah, I think so. It's about tailoring things or really understanding what's the purpose of why you're trying to get this PR, and then what's in it for the publisher essentially, and just pitching it in that way where it's mutually beneficial. Is always going to be the best.
Much better answer. Go with that one.
Cool. I've got another question from Nakul Pednika. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Asks, thoughts on if someone was starting a similar journey to yours now, what platform or style of content to focus on, YouTube or hour-long podcasts, TikTok/Reels and short form only? I think you mentioned previously when we were talking about around that idea of sitting down and doing kind of mock interviews. Is that a good place to start, or how would you answer that question for Nicole?
Again, it depends on what it is that you are hoping to achieve and for what purpose. So if you're an individual content creator, I would think about what is something a little bit different that will attract the right type of audience to come along. That might be a very, I would say the quickest way to grow is probably on Reels and TikTok. Reel stories, TikToks, those sort of things, just things that are short and sharp and punchy. I think they can be really entertaining. I think it's very hard to build credibility and trust through those in the same way because you don't have the length of time to build a connection with that particular person in the same way that I think an hour-long podcast would have, where you get to talk about their backstory and understand them as a person and all those sort of things. So I would say if you're doing it as an individual content creator, maybe that's a good place to start. Again, depending on what you wanted to do with that. And I think from a business perspective, again, it depends on what your objectives are. If you're looking for credibility and trust, I think podcasts are a great way to leverage someone's credibility and trust to get you on and to come and tell your story. I think if you just want to use that as content on social media that you can use to generate leads and build up your brand and things like that way, there's probably easier and quicker ways of being able to do that, like doing those sort of clips. I think, a large part of it is just working backwards. So what is it that you want to achieve? And then just trying to find what are the different avenues, channels, and things like that will help you get there. And I think a large part of it is you just have to test it. I think you can strategize till the cows come home, but a large part of it is you won't know until you start doing it yourself. And so at a certain point, you've just got to press go and just try things and put things out there. It's only an issue if things take off and you change. A lot of the time, no one's going to view it, and so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It's similar to what you were doing when you first started, of just trying a bunch of things, and then that's when things start working, then you can actually think about how do we capitalize on this instead of a lot of theorizing, like you said.
Yeah.
So that's great advice. Got another question, or two-part question from Rui Kazi, who's a fellow podcaster, or there's a similar question, her first one, of how to crack distribution for the podcast. So I don't know if you want to add any more color to that, but her second question, which is interesting, is the best way to get guests for your show. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so also you spoke about grit, like I've been loosely following Rui's journey as well. I think she's got a huge amount of grit and love what she's doing with her show as well. Maybe I'll answer the question about the guests first. So like I said, now I'm in the fortunate position that I get a lot of inbound. A lot of that inbound isn't relevant or isn't going to turn into anything, but it is a lot easier now than it was at the start, where still had to, all of the guests I reached out to, and a lot of them would say no or just would go cold. I think a big part of that is you just have to put yourself out there enough, and you just need one person to say yes. And again, part of my strategy around getting additional guests on was every single guest that I came on, I wanted the experience to be so good for them that they wanted to recommend people within their network that they thought would make great guests as well. And so that was a large part of how I got a couple of great guests on the show early on. The other thing that I would add as well is I think not enough people think about the brand of the show. And what I mean by that is I think that sometimes, especially when you're posting weekly or have a high cadence of publishing, it is very easy to just go, who's the easiest person that I can bring on the show? And let's just churn this out. I think one of the things that I think the bar is raised over time, but I think one of the things that I've always tried to be is very hyper-focused with who I bring on as guests for the show, primarily because I think brand is really, really important. So I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but Cal Henderson, who's a co-founder and CTO of Slack, his PR people reached out asking if he could be on the show. Absolute dream guest, and absolutely, and I had to play it cool when that email came in. But I think a large part of that was the build-up of the previous guests that I had on the show. And I think a lot of the time when you're reaching out to high-caliber guests, one of the first things that they or their people will do is have a look through the list of other previous guests that you've had on the show. And so I think that those details matter, and it does make life more difficult because you have to work harder to get every single interview in. And again, I think at a certain time it switches. So, I think the podcast is in a fortunate enough place where the brand is good enough where we can bring on some of our portfolio companies and use this as a platform to highlight them in some way. But that's after doing this for 7 years of being very hyper-focused on the quality and the bar of the guests that we have on the show. So, if there's one advice that I can give to people, it's just like really being clear and deliberate about what is the type of brand and quality of show that you want to put out and what are the ideal types of guests that you want on. And just making sure that you're not shooting yourself in the foot by not focusing enough or being deliberate enough in the type of brand that you're building in that area.
Mm. Yeah, that's really, really useful advice. Yeah, it's like creating that persona around yourself and the brand around your show so that it just becomes an obvious magnet for the kind of people that you want to attract on there.
Yeah. And if there's one other thing that I can add on to getting guests for the show is one of my big philosophies that sometimes I'm really good at, sometimes I'm really bad at, is not saying no on other people's behalf. Mm. So a lot of the time there are people that you want to reach out to, you go, oh, but they're probably going to say no, so it doesn't matter. You'll be surprised. And again, it won't happen every time. Most of the people will probably say no, but like I said, you just need one person to say yes. And so a big thing for me was if there is someone pushing myself to try and reach out to people that I would feel that normally they would absolutely say no, but I won't say no on their behalf. I'll let them either ignore it or tell me no directly, but at least then I know it's a no. Mm. But don't stop yourself from reaching out to people and shooting your shot with it. Don't be the reason why they don't come on. Let them decide that it's not the right thing for them, but you don't decide on their behalf. Yeah,
that's such key advice of, just don't disqualify yourself. Just put yourself out there, ask the question. The worst thing that can happen is you get a no. Best thing that can happen is you get what you want. So it's great advice. I had a question from Ray Pastors. This is around investing, switching gears a little bit. He asked, what's the best way to pitch your idea or startup to investors or potential partners? Any key do's and don'ts?
Okay. I mean, I think there are two different types of people that you would reach out to, investors and partners. So for investors, I think from a founder perspective, you can put investors on a pedestal with things where, again, looking at things from their perspective, looking at things from our perspective, we want to deploy capital. We want to invest in the best companies. We want to speak to founders that are interesting. And so I think just keeping that, almost like putting yourself in their shoes and trying to figure out what it is that they want and what it is that they want to achieve. And so I think the do's around that is just like making sure that if you are reaching out to a fund or to investors, that you've done your homework around it, to just understand, for us, we are industry agnostic, but we're very stage focused. So we generally invest in pre-seed or seed stage deals. And so you could reach out to us with a Series A opportunity, but it's not going to be the general area that we invest in. And so it's not going to be a fit. Similarly, if you're reaching out to someone with a media company and all they invest in is crypto, like there's just not going to be the alignment there. And so I think just doing your own homework beforehand, just making sure that the types of investment thesis and philosophy that that fund or that investor has, that you're matching that up with yourself, so you're not wasting their or your time with things. And a lot of the time people will publish this on the website or it'll be publicly available somewhere. The other thing about whether it's partners, whether it's investors, I think sales in general is all about putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So what is it that they want to achieve and what does success look like? So again, for us, we want to invest in amazing companies. What does an amazing company look like for us at that stage? And just making sure that that hits those kind of buckets. Similarly for partners as well. If you're looking to bring on a strategic partner for your business, I think that's such a big lever for growth that not a lot of people take full advantage of. But a lot of the time you are going to be partnering with someone who's much bigger than you are. So how does this become a reciprocal relationship where you're not just the one getting the value? Otherwise, like, why would they go for it? What is it that you are bringing to the table for them? So again, like in my first company, we were Stage Label, which is a fashion tech company. We were, I think, one of Uber's first partners in Australia. It's a long time ago, like 11, 12 years ago. And, Uber was this big company that had just come into Australia at that time. I think they only had 2 people on the ground. At that time, they only had Uber Black, which is a premium service. And the pitch to them was, we've got all of these runway shows that we're doing at Melbourne during Fashion Week and all of these events that are tailored towards influencers, people with high disposable income, all of these sort of things. And there's content and all of the stuff that gets created off the back of that. And that was the exact target market that they were trying to create and attract and trying to create a bit more of a buzz. And so although like an early stage company probably had no business doing things with a company of that size that had just come into Australia, we helped them be able to market to and attract a specific type of audience that they were trying to reach. And so that was the reciprocal arrangement that we had in that way. And so, yeah, I think a large part of that is just like trying to figure out in their shoes. And a lot of the time you won't know. So just ask, what does success look like? What are your KPIs? How do I make you look better in your job or in your company? And then just tailor a pitch and hopefully you should be able to deliver on that, but that will help you signal and work out if they're the right partners, because ideally those types of partnerships work best when both of you are providing what the other person's looking for.
Yep. No, really great advice. Again, always that process of putting yourself in their shoes and working out what's important to the other person will always serve you well. Cool. Well, we've got another question from Mark Orchard. He asked whether your time as a co-founder of a high growth company changed the way that you do your content. So the questions you ask, the topics you focused on, or how you vet potential investments.
So yeah, that's a great question. Not surprised. Mark's a great question. He's an awesome guy. Yeah, I think in terms of the impact that kind of running high growth companies has had on the types of content I create, I don't think it shifted the content. I think, like I said earlier, I just ask the questions that I want to know the answers to. And so a lot of the time I will lean on my own experiences or things that I saw or things that I struggled with or challenges that I faced, because again, no company is built separately to everyone else. Everyone goes through the same types of issues. And so I think those experiences have allowed me to hopefully hone in on things that a lot of the listeners are already going through in a way that maybe I wouldn't have the same perspective if I hadn't had those experiences myself. In terms of investing, I don't know if that's necessarily changed that much from an investing perspective. I think the value for me with investing has always been you just get such a wide cross-section of companies and founders. Again, I think that it gave me deeper understandings of the fundraising process. And again, a lot of the challenges that a lot of the listeners are facing, or what that sort of experience is like and things like that on both sides. But I think that one of the really valuable things of investing while running a company is that I think when you're running a company, you just have the data set of one. So you only have your experience, versus the benefit that you have with investing is that you see a lot of different types of companies, and a lot of the time it can shift your frame of reference of what really good looks like. We've had a couple of breakout companies in our portfolio, which we're super fortunate to have one allocation in on. But, I think I learn a ton from a lot of the founders that we've invested in, and learn a lot from their experience. And similarly, I think part of the reason why we can invest in those companies at the early stages as well is because of things that both of us, like you had your own startup as well, both of us have seen or experienced, or things that sometimes, not always, but sometimes we can help them see around corners, or if they're facing particular issues, either we will know about that and can help them ahead of time, or be able to talk through things with them in a way that maybe they might not be able to with other investors, or be able to help them or point them in the right direction with things. So yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily shifted anything. I think it's just become another data point for me personally across the content that I create, but also when we have considerations of the companies that we invest in.
Yeah, it's really just, like you said, like broadening that kind of perspective of what you see, and almost raising, in that case, you're talking about some of those breakout successes, raising the bar in your own mind of what excellent looks like. And that's makes you think, oh, if that's possible and I'm seeing that, I should be doing that as well in my own situation. And so again, it's just like leveling up in your own mind and just seeing a broader range of what's out there, which is very useful, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
So, cool, Rohit. Well, yeah, some really great questions from the audience here. And yeah, I guess as we look to wrap up here, I just wanted to say as well, thank you for everything you've done, especially over the last 8 years. We've known each other for maybe 4 or 5 years, but you've done a lot prior to that. But I've had a close involvement with your journey the past 4 or 5 years, and obviously working with you the past 2 years or so with Playbook Ventures and helping with the podcast. So yeah, I think you've done a phenomenal job, and it's one of those things where I feel like you're a very genuine person, and no matter what sort of context you're in, you're the same person, whether it's in public or in private. And I really appreciate that myself. And I think a lot of people talk nice things behind your back as well, which is always the ultimate test of someone's character. So yeah, thank you for everything you've done with the podcast, and thanks for being a guest on your own podcast today. Is there any closing thoughts that you wanted to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I mean, just first of all, like, very kind of you to say those things. I think when I spoke about the impact that the podcast has had from career and all those sort of things, like, I think it's also allowed us to meet and become friends. And I've made a ton of, other friends and people that I've become very close to from either people that I've just met through the traps of podcasting. And so, which is why I say that when you ask me the question of should people start a podcast, I think there's so much more that you get from doing something like this. It doesn't have to be a podcast, but something like this that just adds a lot to your life outside of just ROI on revenue or things like that you're sort of bringing in. So yeah, mate, thank you for the kind words and for everything you've done to support the podcast and things like that as well over the last little while. And, I'll mention this in the intro, but yeah, just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone that's taken the time to listen to the show, come on the podcast over the last 8 years. I think it's meant a lot for me that a lot of people have taken a punt on taking the time to come on the show, but also for people that have taken the time out of their day to listen to the podcast. And yeah, like I said, it's been completely life-changing. I never thought that things would end up the way that they are today, but I've just always been grateful for so many people that have played such a big part in getting the podcast to where it is today. And, hopefully it's helped people on their journey with things as well. It's really nice when people send in messages. I've got a little folder on my phone of people sharing some things. So yeah, I think that's been the really valuable thing for me and a big part of what's kind of helped me to keep it going is, yeah, just hopefully it playing a part in other people's journey and hopefully helping them with their business or life and all of those sort of things as well. So yeah, just want to say like a ton of gratitude to everyone. So thank you all. And yeah, thanks for today.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, congrats again on 8 years and just the beginning, I'm sure. So we'll see you for 10 years and then a long way into the future beyond that as well. So thanks
awesome,
again.
Mate. Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 192 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I would love to hear what you thought about the slightly different format for the show and if you'd like to hear more episodes like this in the future. we get back to our regular scheduled programming from next week. But in the meantime, as promised, I will drop a link to the event registration page, as well as the full show notes from this episode at startupplaybook.co. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.